In this lesson, we're not actually going to be adding any new features to our project, but instead we'll focus on fixing a couple of bugs and doing a little refactoring. And the first bug related to CSS classes, so once I start tracking the time for one activity, then on activities page, if this time will be negative, then this block will be red. But once this time becomes positive, this block should become green. But as we can see, currently it is shown purple. And the reason to that is because we currently applied two different classes that specify text color, text purple 600 and text green 600. So as you can see in here, purple class actually overrides green class. So we have to go back to activity seconds to complete component. And right here we currently have two computed properties. First one has list of all the classes that are applied to that block that shows the remaining time. And there is also one more computed property called color classes. And this computed property is specifically for deriving color classes depending on the current time difference. So we only have to rely on these color classes, which means we no longer need those classes which specify purple color. So let's remove this class text purple 600 as well as bg purple 100. And now let's just quickly test if this works as expected. As always, I'm gonna start tracking time for the coding activity, and on the activities page, let's wait until this block becomes green, once the time becomes positive. And as you can see, this time everything is working fine. So let's continue. The next thing we're going to fix is related to progress item component. This is the component which is responsible for showing the progress scale for particular activity. So if I'm going to start tracking time for the coding activity, then on the progress page, we're gonna see that the scale is growing. But look what happens if I, for example, change this activity by using this select box. In this case, the scale for this activity starts from 0. But in fact, this scale should continue growing from that point where the previous scale has stopped. And another issue is that after resetting this time, we can see that the percentage shows the wrong number right here. So when we reset the time, this percentage should basically show 0. So let's see why this is happening. And right away, let's open up timeline stopwatch component. It is the component that renders our stopwatch. And in here, previously we have created additional constant to simplify our testing. It's this temp constant. And in order to make our scale grow faster, every second we are adding 2 minutes to activity seconds property, so that the track time for a particular activity will be growing by 2 minutes every second. But this is only a temporary solution to simplify our testing of progress scales. And also we're multiplying value of seconds by this coefficient temp inside of reset function. But when we change activity by using the select box on timeline items page, this watcher kicks in and it assigns current time of the stopwatch to activity seconds property to the current timeline item. So in this case, we also have to multiply value of seconds by that coefficient temp to keep this time in sync. This looks quite confusing, but actually let's see if it worked. So let's start tracking time for the coding activity and make sure that the progress scale grows for this activity. And then if we go back to timeline page and change this activity, then on the progress page, we will notice that this progress scale didn't start from 0, and also we're going to get proper value of percentage once we reset the time of this stopwatch. So as expected, we got number 0. Next, let's work on the base icon component and try to simplify it a little bit. So currently this component accepts one property called classes, and let's review one example. So inside the header progress component, we have an icon called check circle, and this icon accepts custom classes that we are passing into this component by using classes prop. And of course, that prop gets assigned to the root element of the icon component. But why don't we try to stick to the standard HTML API and use attribute class instead of classes? So let's see if we can make this work. I'm going to specify attribute class, and now moving back to base icon component. And here, in order to actually access values of attributes that were assigned to this component from outside, and additionally if we haven't declared any props for those attributes or events by using macro define emits, we could access those attributes by using the special object $authors. So if I would like to read the value of the class attribute, I'm gonna have to reference this property via authors object like this. And this lets us not to declare any additional properties inside this component, which means we can remove classes declaration. And right away, validation function is not empty string becomes unused. Let's remove this import, and we can make this function private inside validators module. Let's just stop exporting this function by removing this export keyword. And also, to group private function in one place, let's move this function to the rest of private functions. Closer to is string validator. So right now, let's go for example inside activity item component. Here we have an icon which uses default classes. So we're not passing any custom classes to base icon component. In this case, this property class will be undefined, which means we're gonna fall back to default class h8. But for the icon which is used inside the header progress component where we specified custom classes by using class attribute, in this case, these classes will be applied to an icon. And if we inspect both of these icons in the browser, firstly, trash icon, we can see that the default class was applied to this SVG tag. And also if we inspect an icon inside the header progress component, we also see that this SVG tag has those custom classes that we have previously specified by using class attribute on base icon component. And this way we were able to simplify base icon component a little bit. So let's go next and try to simplify the behavior which scrolls the page to a particular timeline item when clicking on these hour labels. And the way we're currently implementing this behavior is by using events that we are firing from the child component to the parent component. Let's jump into timeline item component, and here on timeline hour component we have a listener registered for the click event, and when this event gets fired, we're actually sending scroll to hour event to the timeline component. And of course in here we have a listener registered to listen for this event, and once this event is received, we're executing scroll to hour function that we, by the way, imported from our global module timeline items. And since our handler is currently contained inside of the global module timeline item, there is nothing stopping us to actually import this handler directly inside timeline hour component. So we will no longer need to fire custom events from component to component in order to trigger this function when we click on timeline hour label. So let's just move this listener registration directly on the root element inside the timeline hour component. And since this function also accepts an hour that we have to scroll the page to, we have to pass it as a first param. So let's just go ahead and write an import statement for the scroll to hour function inside timeline hour component. So we need to import this function from one of the global modules called timeline items. And instead inside the timeline component this function is no longer needed, so let's remove this import, also apply formatting to this file, and we also don't need to register listener for scroll to hour event since this event is no longer sent to this component. Let's remove this registration. And now let's also remove an event registration inside timeline item component for scroll to hour event. We don't need to use this define inits macro anymore, as well as that is undefined validation function. Let's also remove this import. So now we're handling clicks on our labels directly inside timeline hour component because we were able to get access to scroll to hour function in this component by simply importing this function from timeline items module. So as we can see, clicks are still working, the page is properly scrolled to a particular timeline item. And when we're gonna click on the logo, the page will be scrolled to current timeline item. And also, if going back to timeline page from another page, the page should also be scrolled to current timeline item. As we can see, this also works. And finally, if we refresh the page, we also have to see that the page will be automatically scrolled to current timeline item. Everything is working fine. We can continue in the next lesson.